I was mentioning in the, if you were just listening before 8 o'clock news and what we call the show tease, top story tease is what we call it here. Kelton Hatch will be along in the next hour. He is joining us from Idaho Fish and Game, and he'll have a lot to talk about as far as just some of the projects they're working on. He'll also be available to take some of your telephone calls as well. And we're getting into a nice time of year. A lot of people are going to be outside, and you might have a question or two that you'd like to pose while he's here, and he's more than willing to answer that. Also, in a few minutes, I saw something yesterday, and I was going to gloss over it. Just briefly took a look at the headline, and then decided to actually read it. It's a long piece in the op-ed pages of the New York Times about Obamacare. Now, this was a really hot topic 3 years ago on talk radio, maybe not quite so much anymore because the fallout from it is pretty much done and people have either adjusted or they're hoping to wait it out. But since Obamacare was adopted, the American public's view of healthcare as a right has flip-flopped. And I'll tell you in a little while how it flip-flopped. I mean, what Americans are actually believing now is a majority versus what they believed 7 or 8 years ago. You may be surprised by some of this. Also, I wanted to mention off the top of the show, look, we have been, ever since that situation in Indiana a few weeks ago, and followed by Arkansas as well, we have been having a discussion about how Christians are being treated in mainstream American culture anymore, by mainstream media, by people in entertainment, by people in academia, even by the courts, which it appears that Christians no longer have what you'd call a friend in the United States any longer. And we joked maybe at times that Christianity will go underground, will be back in the catacombs before all is said and done, and that if you're a Christian, you may be fed to the lions. And people out there laugh and say, yeah, that'll never really happen. But some days you just sit down and you wonder, and I realize we have a lot of people who are still practicing Christians in our listening audience. I meet some of them from time to time, and I get emails from them, and we've got them calling the radio show as well. Here's the thing, and even for people who don't necessarily go to church every weekend, a lot of them still feel that the message is true. I have friends, a lot of great friends who tell me I don't feel I have to believe to be in a building every weekend with the rest of you, all sitting under the roof. I think that I can still commune with the Lord. Look, I'm not trying to judge people. I'm just telling you right off the top, I have a different view on that, and we're okay. I mean, that's not a huge issue for me. So I think a lot of people realize when we're talking about this that there is some validity to the concerns some people have who are of the Christian faith, because you don't see religious minorities in this country, Muslims, Hindus, Jews, really getting a lot of grief. Well, the Jews would obviously say they certainly are under the Obama administration, at least in light of what's taking place in the Middle East. I wanted to focus right off the top of the show today, though, off a series of stories that I collected just within the last 2 hours before I actually came on air. And as I was looking through these, I was thinking, is there a thread that is connecting all of them? First is a piece from rightwingnews.com. I don't think that name, rightwingnews.com, needs much of an explanation, but it's still a true story. It's written by a fellow by the name of Warner Todd Houston. Here's the headline: Pastor who asked gay bakery for a Christian cake being charged with a crime. You're asking yourself, huh? Wait a minute. What's going on here? 34 at our studios, 10 minutes after 8 o'clock. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on newsradio1310.com and News Radio. Well, that's our website, News Radio 1310 KLIX, of course, being the radio station. I would advise you check out the web every now and then. Just look at the website. If you go to my name, the on-air list, you go to my name and you hit Bill Colley's commentaries. You can also find, there's so much I don't get to talk about. We have such a limited time on the show. And when I have a day where I have a lot of guests too as well, we have, I think the actual talk time in the 2-hour time slot, the actual time we're on the air talking is about 75 minutes. So if you have a guest that takes up half an hour or an hour, it's considerably reduced. Some days we only actually have maybe 10, 15 minutes of actual just direct talk time where I'm on the air with you. But I happened to come across this today, and I may be blogging about this later on too as well. The cake controversies are continuing, the writer says, but this time in reverse, as a Christian pastor who asked a gay bakery to bake a cake with a Christian message on it was refused service. But instead of the bakery being charged, it seems that the pastor is faced with criminal action. What? All right, wait a minute here. If I refuse to bake a cake for a same-sex marriage ceremony, I'm going to be in trouble. We've been told that that's necessary, that it would be disrespectful, mean, and hurtful, and, when somebody's feelings are hurt, that has to be criminalized. So why is this working not in the same way in reverse? Well, the baker, her name, by the way, is included in this. Her name is Haller. The pastor's name is Feuerstein. She refused, and Feuerstein posted the video of her refusal on his YouTube channel. Haller then demanded, that's the gay baker, that Feuerstein take down the video, and he did as he was asked. So he was polite enough to say, all right, I'll take the video down. He was trying to prove a point, and that was all he needed to do. But then she reposted the video herself and used it to attack the pastor. Then the shop owner, she called the FBI to demand that they charge him with a hate crime. She complained of, quote, nasty, unquote, phone calls, and also, quote, negative gestures, unquote. She said that she lost money and was investigating her legal options, noting that she recorded recorded phone call, that is between she and the pastor, is illegal in Florida. According to LifeSite News, she said she had reached out to the FBI regarding a possible criminal case. Now, there's a video that was posted a couple of weeks ago online where a guy actually walks into several Islamic bakeries and asks for them to bake a gay cake, and they won't do it. What's a gay cake? Well, the message on it, Jim and John together forever, whatever it was. And they haven't complained, and no one is actually going to them and trying to force them to make any changes. But there you go. So the pastor who called this woman up and she refused, and he apparently recorded the call. Now there is an argument going on in many states about what is two-party consent or is it one-party consent. I don't know the Florida law. She may well know it. He may have violated that law. But asking him to be investigated for a hate crime because he's trying to make a point, I don't think that's going to fly. But then I didn't think they would be forcing people to go ahead and bake cakes and take photographs and do all of those things. That was a shock to me when we discovered that no longer did that freedom of religion apply in this country, even though, according to the Constitution, it does. Over at the Washington Times this morning, this headline: U.S. military hostile to Christians under Obama, morale and retention devastated. Jacqueline Klimas, the writer. Soon there may only be atheists in the foxhole, she writes. Christians are leaving the U.S. military or are discouraged from joining in the first place because of a hostile work environment that doesn't let them express their beliefs openly, religious freedom advocates say. And then they go on to talk about all of the chaplains. We've mentioned this before on the air. The chaplains who are being bounced out of the military because, good grief, these Christian chaplains are talking about Jesus. Oh, we can't have that. Again, what did they expect they would talk about? Oh, they talked about the Bible too, and that's wrong. Well, once more, their faith is based on that book. I mean, it's at least in most denominations, that is the truth, right? And even if some people don't believe that every word in it is the word of God, that it was divinely inspired in that sense, perhaps they still use the book, right? That's sort of the bedrock of the faith. I had a conversation a few years ago with two Marines. I was in a diner. They were working on a charity, and I was talking with them about how I might help out as a radio talk show host. One of them is the grandson of the former middleweight boxing champion, Joey Giardello. And I got talking to these two young men, and they were explaining to me that they left the U.S. Marine Corps because they felt that it had become so politically correct. They wanted nothing to do with it any longer. About a week later, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, and he has since left the U.S. Army. And he had been in the Army for a number of years, and he had served, of course, just as the Marines had, overseas at war. And I was telling him what had happened to them, and he said, well, there you go again, same thing with me. He said, we're seeing the same thing in the Army. He said, the Army I knew in the 1990s, entirely different from the Army I know today. So he ended up walking away from it. He's now living in Hawaii. He was at Fort Hood the day that Major Nidal Hassan decided to start shooting up fellow troops. And he said that was the last straw with the political correctness. And I have a friend serving in Alaska right now in the Army, and he is at the rank of colonel. He could be going up to the rank of general, but he also says he's going to be leaving at the end of his 20, getting out for good, because he said the same thing. Political correctness is destroying the military that he loved. So you have that going on, and all of these people I've mentioned, by the way, were very devout Christians, and they just feel that the military, again, was hostile to them. So I'm not just reading this story from the Washington Times. I'm sharing with you the experiences of 4 people I know two in the Marine Corps, two in the Army, who had the same impression. And over at the Air Force, they have the same impression. A friend of mine who was an Air Force officer put up a blog post about this the other day, talking about, well, how did he put it? Curtis LeMay would be turning over in his grave. And my friend actually knew Curtis LeMay, so he can actually speak from his own firsthand knowledge about how LeMay would feel in that situation. Here's another one. This one comes from Accuracy in Media. Cliff Kincaid reporting, sexual madness in Obama's America. NBC reported the other day, for the first time in history, the White House has designated a gender-neutral restroom for visitors and staffers. The latest in a series of steps the administration has taken to protect the rights of members of the LGBT community. You know, I always thought that was a bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich, but somebody had to educate me along the lines. At the risk of sounding politically incorrect, the writer says, isn't there an obligation on the part of NBC News to at least consider giving some space or attention to an opposing view? Like some people who may be uncomfortable. I worked at a TV station in the late 1990s, and one of the engineers on staff suddenly announced one day he was divorcing his wife, and he no longer wanted to be known as Scott. He wanted to be known as Sharon, and that he would be transitioning, and that he was going to be he started wearing ladies' clothes to work, and he started using the ladies' bathroom. The other women at work were not happy about this because, he could still use the urinal, and they thought that if they were in the bathroom at the same time, and he came in and he was doing that, they just felt a little bit icky about the whole thing. And I don't think that was an unusual response on their part. I don't think that they were being bigoted. I don't think that they hated the guy. They just felt that they didn't want to be in the same bathroom with him. And yet we're told this has to happen because his feelings would be hurt otherwise. Finally, over at Crisis Magazine, Jennifer Roback Morse. She says why religious liberty arguments aren't working any longer. She says an increasing number of our fellow citizens do not believe in any God, so therefore, why would they care if you felt that your rights were being infringed upon, your religious liberty? Why would they care? And they don't, she simply says. We have a very selfish culture now. Secondly, the controversies over religious liberty are not about transubstantiation or the Trinity or predestination. We're arguing about sex, abortion, contraception, homosexuality, and similar topics. Our fellow citizens have absorbed and are committed to a particular view about the meaning of human sexuality and its place in our lives. Millions of people have ordered their lives around these beliefs. They are not going to give up those views in the absence of an alternative. Reason number 2, and she says it has to be an attractive alternative. Religious liberty arguments are not working. We are asking our fellow citizens to give up something that they value without offering anything they value in its place. So why religious liberty arguments aren't working? We sound like we are whining about ourselves and no one finds that appealing. So she said we need to come up with something that's an alternative that explains how bad the sexual revolution actually was for the culture and how it's important for the children and grandchildren, ours in many cases, to have an alternative in the future. And she says we're not doing a very good job of it. 20 minutes after 8 o'clock. Hey, some news on Obamacare on the way. Bill Colley with you this morning, 35 at our studios. This is Top Story. If you were with us between 8:30 and 9 o'clock yesterday morning, you heard Dr. Jonathan Tripp in the studio with us. That is part, of course, of our show, Better Health with Tripp Family Medicine. We do that on a weekly basis, Wednesday mornings. And again, we'll have the doctor or another representative, another healthcare professional from the office coming by next Wednesday morning. And we'll be taking some of your telephone calls, too, as well. If you have a question or comment about the topic, or if you have another health issue you would like to bring up. As I said yesterday, you rarely ever get an opportunity to ask for free a little medical advice. Well, at least someone to point you in the right direction. You have that opportunity Wednesday mornings. So you can tune in next Wednesday morning at 8:30 for Better Health with Tripp Family Medicine. And Tripp Family Medicine, if you did not know, is located on Fulton Street. Was it Fulton? No, Fillmore, excuse me. Fulton is a guy who built steamboats. We have all these presidential streets. Do we actually have a Clinton Street yet? Do we need one? And when will we get the Obama Street? But anyway, they're located on Fillmore Street in Twin Falls, directly across the street from the main post office. And remember, life's too short not to feel good. And that is the goal of the office. Also, I've been telling you for a long time, we have some great people who make this program possible, including the folks at Western States Bus Services, where they are hiring part-time bus drivers right now, split shifts, 5 days per week, summers off, and scheduled no school days. Pay is $10.75 per hour. Apply today by contacting 733-8003. Western States Bus Services is an equal opportunity employer. So yesterday, I was just getting ready to leave work and I saw a headline on the web from the New York Times, which some people would call the Bible of American liberalism. I don't spend a lot of time reading it because I'm not going to pay for a subscription. I've got a couple of these online subscriptions as it is, and after a while, you just don't have time, and you figure, what you're paying every month. Nah, if I had someone else to read it for me, maybe, but they could pay for it on their own then. It's 8:26. Bill Colley with you on Top Story this morning on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. That means you can listen to us anywhere around the world online. A writer by the name of Thomas B. Edsel says, with the advent of the Affordable Care Act, which is known as Obamacare, the share of Americans convinced that health care is a right shrank from a majority to a minority. There's nothing mentioned. Did you ever notice that in that Constitution? I mean, do you read it? I have a pocket copy here that I keep with me. In fact, it's got the Declaration of Independence included there. If I could just, you can hear the pages there flipping. And I keep this with me because I think it's important to actually know what the document says. And it's a big help when you have an argument with someone, especially, we get a couple of liberal callers here every now and then who think that we should run the country on polling data. Well, all right. Speaking of polling data, the writer says this shift in public opinion is a major victory for the Republican Party. It is part of a larger trend, a steady decline in support for redistributive programs. That is, government policies to take money from one group and give the money to somebody else. In 2006, so less than a decade ago, by a margin of more than 2-1, 69 to 28, those surveyed by Gallup said that the federal government should guarantee health care coverage for all citizens of the United States. Okay. By late 2014, however, Gallup found that this percentage had fallen 24 points to 45%, while the percentage of respondents who said health care is not a federal responsibility nearly doubled to 52%. Although most Americans still believe their employers should cover them, or at least grant them coverage. You realize this whole notion of employee coverage, health care coverage, goes back to Henry Ford. Henry Ford thought, well, if my guys aren't sneezing all the time and hacking and coughing, they can be at work and I can get better production out of the Ford plant. The old Rouge plant, that thing was just enormous. And he said that we needed to give them some benefit like that in order to keep them on the job. So he recognized that. But then it became something standard across America, and people get to the point where they expect it. They expect your employer is going to provide this. Well, your employer's main goal is to sell a product. But, the expectations of the public have changed. The Kaiser survey, this is from a healthcare organization, that's the Kaiser Foundation, found strong opposition, 64 to 35, to the individual mandate requiring that everyone purchase health coverage. But in contrast, a majority of respondents, 60 to 38, supported the employer mandate that requires companies with 100 or more workers to provide health insurance. So in other words, a bad old company, they owe me, which seems to be the old labor union, response on all of this, is that somehow you deserve it, and so therefore you should have it. An earlier New York Times poll conducted in December 2 years ago found that 52% of those surveyed believed that Obamacare would increase their medical costs. Well, yeah. 14% said it would reduce costs. They were the hardcore Democrats. 36% believed that Obamacare would worsen the quality of health care compared to 17% who thought it would improve it. This is 5 pages long. He breaks this all down. But, Lefty wants to rule the country not by the Constitution, but by polling data. We keep hearing, well, a majority of Americans support this or that, and therefore that's what we should do. Well, okay, then let's sack Obamacare. Let's get rid of it. Let's put it on the ash heap and forget about it. And maybe let's go back to something called an indemnity plan. Long before, and I'm not blaming just Democrats. Richard Nixon was the guy who came up with the idea of health maintenance organizations. He got on board with that. HMOs have helped destroy the healthcare industry in this country. This notion is, look, you get auto insurance. Your auto insurance does not cover your oil changes. Your auto insurance is for something much larger. We'll get back to this topic. I'll take your calls in just a couple of minutes on it, but we have a hard break at 8:30. It's 35. Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310 KLIX, and newsradio1310.com means you can hear us anywhere online, all over the world. And as I say, more on this topic ahead. We'll take your calls in just a couple of minutes. I often give out my email address along with a telephone number. I have to admit, I don't get many people emailing me, although the few people who do it frequently. And I'd like to thank some of them because I get some great material for the program. And even if I don't mention it, it sometimes helps me with my thinking process. It's bill.colley at townsquaremedia.com. That is bill.colley at townsquaremedia.com, last name spelled Colley. You can also reach me, of course, by telephone, which is the way most people do it. 736-0300, 736-0300. And I was sharing a few minutes ago about Obamacare, how it has had an unintended consequence. American people, when they were surveyed in the latter part of the middle of the last decade, said that health care was a right, even though it's not enumerated in the Constitution in any place. They felt it was owed them, especially, a lot of the younger people out there who feel a sense of entitlement. I assume that they were taking part in all of this. Now that Obamacare is actually in place, the numbers have literally flip-flopped. Far more people are opposed to Obamacare and do not believe that health care is a right, that government does not need to be in this situation. Why? Because they've seen the impact of Obamacare. I heard a coworker talking yesterday because taxes were due. If you owed your taxes, they were due yesterday. I heard a coworker saying that somebody she knows in her family had spent the last 4 days trying to reach the IRS with a question. Why can't the IRS pick up the telephone? Because the IRS is overwhelmed by the Obamacare regulations. 47 new regulations, and the IRS has been put in charge of enforcement. So they've gone from just intimidating Tea Party organizations to having, to chase down people who may not have had insurance last year or for part of the year. And all of these things are overwhelming the Internal Revenue Service, which is maybe not a bad thing, I suppose, in one sense. But if you needed to get in touch with them in the waning days when you actually owed them money and you couldn't, or you thought you owed them money, or perhaps thought maybe you were getting money back, this is going to be a problem. And this is part of the Obamacare, how shall we put it, fallout. It's not radioactive yet, but it may be getting there quite soon. So you've got that going on, and it's impacting people all over the country. An indemnity plan, which was what my parents had in the late 1960s and through a good part of the 1970s, meant that if you went to the doctor and you had a cold, your insurance didn't cover that. The doctor once gave me a shot of vitamin B right in one of my cheeks, and I'm not talking about my face. The cold only lasted a few days. I couldn't sit down for 2 weeks. I don't know that it was necessarily a good idea, but mainly my parents said when we had colds, you'll get over it. Go sit by the furnace. And that's what you did. And, you drank some chicken soup and you were better in a few days. But we didn't have insurance picking up huge portions of that cost. The doctor charged a reasonable amount, knowing that it was coming out of mom and dad's pockets. Insurance was for major surgery and things like that you might require. And that's what it helped you with. And you know what? Most people found it was affordable to handle those policies in that day and age. Today, I can remember working on a job a few years ago, and I was told that if I was just insuring myself, I'd only have to pay about $160 a pay period. And then I was told if you'd like to insure your daughter, you're going to be paying $474. Whoa. And I looked at what I was earning on a weekly basis, and I thought, I don't know that this is something that I can do. I mean, but I had to dig down and do it. And unfortunately, a lot of people are faced with these very difficult choices, and now if you choose not to have insurance, the government's going to come after you. You're up next. You're on the air with Bill Colley on Top Story. It's 8:38. What's on your mind?
How's it going? Hey, I'm new to the area. I used to live here, and I just moved back, and I was wondering what happened to Kelly and Jill. Not that I don't enjoy your program.
Kelly has decided to do a lot more photography, and he's doing some fishing and the like and enjoying retirement. And I believe Jill is looking at writing some more cookbooks. But I thank you much for the call, sir. You're up next. You're on the air with Bill Colley on Top Story.
Yeah, I think the thing with the Obamacare is people realize that it costs money. My parents, my father took out early retirement because the company he was working for was about ready to go under. And they were about to lay off a bunch of people. And so he took out early retirement because he was old enough. And he left with his benefit package. And he paid what the company paid for his insurance, which was great. At that time it was $200 for him and mom to have insurance. because of Obamacare, his rates have skyrocketed to $1,500 a month.
I am not shocked.
And as a retired person, that's what he brings in.
I thank you for the call. I picked up the Cobra one time from a previous employer, and when I discovered I was paying $1,138 a month, that's what the company mainly had been paying. I had paid a small percentage of that, and I realized what that benefit was to me. If that had been actual pay, I would have been making a huge amount of money, much more every year in that particular situation. And I was working for the Ackley Group at the time, which was based out of Seattle, and I belatedly thanked them for what they had been doing for me. The caller brought up a good point. People thought it was going to be free. A lot of people who logged on thinking they'd sign up for it, you're right. We're not talking about people here who were paying a whole lot of attention. They were busy watching American Idol, in doing those things, or thinking that Obama gave them a free phone. So they logged on, and when they got onto the computer, they said, wait a minute, you mean I got to pay something for this? They thought you were going to buy it for them. You see, that was okay. As long as the neighbor got gouged, I'm on board. But when I actually have to pay, oh, gee willikers. No, it's not single payer, as they call it. 37 at our studios. More on this topic ahead. Story on the AP wire this morning. I've got to mention this because I've got a guest coming up in the next hour of the program. So I'd like to get through some of these things early. Well, I've been up since 3 o'clock this morning, so. All right, late for me, but maybe early for a lot of you. The leader of Idaho's pro-business lobby has been reinstated after being placed on leave for sending a profanity-laced email about a state senator. How often do we all feel like doing that? I'll tell you what. Why shouldn't somebody... He didn't send it to the senator. He sent it to somebody else, and then it became public. But what do they say? If you're going to do anything online, always consider that it's not going to be private. Well, number one, the NSA probably knew the contents of it, of course, right after it was sent. But other people you work with may not always be kind and may decide to somebody may have been looking to, help hasten his downfall. This comes from the Associated Press. The Idaho Association of Commerce and Industry reinstated Alex LeBeau as president on Monday. Good for him. The fact of the matter is he was venting because he was unhappy with some actions going on in the state legislature. Shouldn't we all be allowed to do that? He had been placed on leave in early March. IACI officials have declined to say whether the leave was paid or unpaid. LeBeau had sent an email in January criticizing Senator Jeff Sidaway for insisting that lawmakers raise teacher pay to $40,000 per year before he would consider any bills to lower taxes. Now remember, he's talking about a lot of Republicans here, too, and from the standpoint of business and industry, the Republicans claim to be your friend, and sometimes they are not. In the email, LeBeau described Sidaway as, quote, completely irrelevant, unquote, that's the clean part, and suggested the group introduce retaliation legislation. Jason Rock, the organization's former acting director, says details of the personnel issue won't be made public because this is not, I should point out, a governmental organization. This is a private organization, but the situation prompted conversations about the organization's mission and direction. LeBeau has led the organization since 2006. You ever hear this guy, Martin O'Malley? He's the supposed challenger to Hillary Clinton, maybe, in the Democrat primaries for president next year. He used to be the governor of the state of Maryland, and he left there in January. Well, they had something called the millionaire's tax that drove most of the wealthy people out of the state, and he was replaced by a Republican. He had decided not to run. He handpicked his successor, and his successor lost, which shows you just the public was dang sick and tired of the guy. But Mr. O'Malley had been creating all sorts of laws and been lax on immigration issues. And a few years ago, there was a guy who had been making a great living hanging drywall. The story got some national attention at the time. I'm sure it's probably mainly forgotten now. But the guy was online and he was venting and said, I'd like to strangle the governor. Blew off some steam and should you say that publicly? I guess not, because not long after that, state police kicked down his door. He got dragged away and was charged with making threats, as if the guy actually had any intention of, he was talking, I think, in a figurative sense, and just, as I say, blowing off steam. Because why did he say that? Well, illegal aliens were coming into his state and they were hanging drywall. And they weren't necessarily the most experienced people in the world, but they would do it for, pennies on the dollar. So the experienced guys couldn't find work any longer, but were told, of course, this is a great idea. We've got to bring these people in. We've got to fill the country with them. And it'll be good for business. Not yours, but it'll be good for somebody else's business. Again, that's America's all about being special interest selfish today. But it's the same idea, isn't it? So you've got LeBeau, who didn't, by the way, threaten anyone. He just said nasty words about somebody in state government. And they made him go sit on the sidelines for a couple of months. Why? Because he's got an opinion? I'm sorry, but he should be entitled to that. Was it crass to say that? Yeah, okay, it was. Would you want your children to see it? Probably not. But you know what? We all have blown off steam now and then. And it's similar to the guy in Maryland. He was just blowing off steam. I should point out eventually, the courts came in and agreed that he was just venting, and they set the guy free. And it all went away at that point. But they made his life miserable for a while, and he had to pay a lot of money in legal expenses. So I guess he did lose in the long run, and it chilled the atmosphere for other people who might have been willing to criticize somebody in government at the time. But I see similarities in the stories that are going on here. 8:48, Bill Colley with you, 37 at our studios. It's 37 outside, we should point out. It's considerably warmer inside. Otherwise, I'd be doing this show in a parka. I've had to do that at some previous radio stations. If you'd like to give me a shout this morning, you can reach me at 736-0300, 736-0300. Oh, speaking of O'Malley challenging Clinton, he's already come out again, I think just yesterday. It's on the Drudge Report today, saying that she's a big phony. Man, her campaign, the media is just like walking along, salivating behind this woman. An NBC reporter, it's on Real Clear Politics this morning, an NBC reporter tried to ask her some questions and got completely blown off, and the NBC reporter actually airs the exchange with Clinton, who keeps just talking over her and rushes off and jumps in the van. It looks like something straight out of the A-Team. And she goes racing away, and the reporter stood there showing the soundbite last night on TV, and then the reporter essentially said, "Isn't Hillary just great? Oh, I'd like to shine her shoes." So she's wetting all over the press, and the press is enjoying it. The press complains about Barack Obama being rude to them. I mean, he's had reporters investigated and threatened, and they've come forward and talked about it, and then they all turn around with Stockholm Syndrome and say it's okay. Well, Clinton, according to O'Malley, is a big phony. Story broke yesterday. It's been downplayed already by the folks in mainstream media that Hillary had been going around the country telling people that her grandparents were all immigrants. Well, one of them was, and he moved here when he was 3 years old. Turns out the rest were all born in the USA. And Clinton says, "Well, I was trying to make a point, and when the sun shone and the Jupiter was in the path of Mars, and there was a comet flying by, well, of course, as you understand, that the azimuth is connected to the vermouth, which is connected to the lindenmuth, and therefore that's why I said it." And the media went, "Wow, she's so profound." So there's a story this morning also at Drudge. They're linking to a story from Town Square Media. Not, that's us. Townhall.com. No relation. Although it'd be nice if they were. I could probably get some of them on the air as guests now and then. Wayne Allen Root, who's a former presidential candidate on the Libertarian ticket, refers to her as Tricky Dicky Hillary, saying that if we could only tie her more and more to her Nixonian streak, she might implode. But I think she's going to do that on her own, even with all the fawning media attention that's currently going on. You know that the New York Times, I don't know if you heard this the other day, the New York Times, after she stopped at Chipotle, she looked like the bag lady there with the big glasses on, and she and Huma Ahmadid, which is the wife of Anthony Weiner, she's still with him, by the way, despite his proclivities, his online proclivities. She and this Huma, they stopped in to get some lunch at a Chipotle where they ignored everybody else in the restaurant, didn't talk to a soul. Apparently no one recognized Clinton either. No makeup on. People who are running for the exits, actually, to be honest with you. But the New York Times then broke down the nutritional value of what she had for lunch that day. That was the Times coverage of her day. The Times didn't say, hey, she went in there and she didn't talk to a soul and pretended she didn't like anybody else around her. Actually, she doesn't. But the Times focused instead on the nutritional content of her lunch. This is considered journalism today. And you wonder why those of us in talk radio are such critics of the folks who work in newspapering and at television news networks, the old alphabet networks and MSDNC and the CNN known as the Clinton News Network. You wonder why that happens. Well, don't you think there's some evidence right there? But the fact is, the media doesn't want to ask her any difficult questions, and they let her get away with not answering in the first place. And instead write about there were 468 calories in the salad that she had, and because she had it with a vinaigrette versus having some ranch dressing on it, it'll be much better for her arteries in the long run. Therefore, she won't be having a heart attack as president, because we all know that the old Republicans would. But even though she's old, no, it's not going to happen to her because she's eating healthily. You know that's the image that is being sold to us at this point. A fellow by the name of Christopher Harper is writing at Washington Times. He says it's time for journalists to come clean. Now, a buddy of mine used to work with Christopher Harper at a TV show called Nightline. My buddy was the director. He did not get on air. But Harper was one of the reporters, and he worked for ABC News for a number of years. He was a newspaper reporter at one time. And, I should point out, he's an Idahoan. He says, I come from flyover country, Idaho, Colorado, and South Dakota. I even wrote a book about it. He says, I face battles over liberal bias in the academic world, although my journalism colleagues generally respect my views. Others outside my department do not. He's now teaching at a university in Philadelphia. He says, in my misspent youth, I voted for George McGovern. Give me a shower, please, in 1972. He says, I thought Ronald Reagan was a dreadful president until I looked at his record. After being a liberal for many years, I found the presidency of Bill Clinton abhorrent because of his sexual misconduct. When I broke from the ranks, he writes, I was ostracized. I wonder if that's painful. I produced a story for 2020 about U.S. Department of Justice investigations of former World War II Nazi collaborators. I interviewed, he says, Pat Buchanan, a critic of U.S. government probes. One prominent producer, the sister of Rolling Stone publisher Jan Wenner, told me she was disgusted that I let Mr. Buchanan say his piece. And then he goes on to break down that he is a conservative Roman Catholic. He is opposed to abortion. And he said he applauded former President George Bush for the invasion of Afghanistan. He's still not sure about Iraq. He says, I give money to the church, even though I produced one of the first investigations about pedophilia and the priesthood all the way back in 1979. And he says, he breaks this all down, and he says, reporters have to start telling you this. And they tell you they check their hats at the door, but they don't. If you were watching, for instance, Chuck Todd report on Hillary Clinton's campaign, you would think that he was working for her, that he was drawing a check. And you know he's a Democrat. Why do we continue with allowing these people to tell us they're being balanced and fair when in reality they aren't? Look, I am a Republican Party operative. I admit that. I worked on a U.S. Senate campaign in Michigan last year for a Republican candidate. I was also working as a consultant, media consultant, for 2 state legislative candidates in Delaware and eventually 2 county council candidates in that very same state. So I had a busy time from summer last year through fall. And I make no bones about it. I believe in the message that a great many of these people have. And so I'm very transparent about it. But when you pick up your local newspaper and you're reading the story that a reporter wrote, or you're watching them on network news talk about a particular candidate, I mean, they may think that they're pulling one over on you. But I think we all know. It's like when you read the op-ed pages at the newspaper here in Twin Falls. When you read the op-ed pages, you understand immediately these people are Marxist-Leninists. For crying out loud, it is so obvious. It is obvious as the noses on their faces. And unfortunately, they won't admit it. They'll say, no, we checked that at the door. Baloney. I read the op-ed pages some years ago. Bill Keller, former executive editor at the New York Times, he's now writing for a magazine, and his liberalism is completely on display. But he was on C-SPAN. I hate to admit it, I was watching C-SPAN one morning. I didn't have much going on in my life. And Brian Lamb was asking him some questions, and a caller phoned in and said, well, what are your political views? And Bill Keller says, I don't discuss that publicly. The caller said, well, why not? Keller said, well, if I did that and people understood or people knew what I actually believed in, then my reporters would try and write their stories in order to please me. I thought, does he not believe that his reporters read the own editorial pages at their newspaper? I mean, he and his colleagues of communists, they were all sitting down writing all of these editorials every day, just railing against the Bush administration and every other calumny they could raise about Republicans. and celebrating the notion that we had to take from the rich and give to the poor. In fact, we just had to have the government run everything and maybe put us in cinder block houses and give us ration books. Do you think that his reporters, when they were reading that op-ed page, didn't know what he believed in? For crying out loud, they've got to stop deluding themselves, which is exactly what they're doing. And if you believe their baloney, then you're deluding yourself. And these people, when they grew up and their parents told them that onanism would make their brains soft, they should have listened. But they didn't. And that concludes the commentary part of the program today. Kelton Hatch is coming along shortly. We are going to do something entirely different in the next hour. Kelton is going to talk to us about some issues involving fish and wildlife here in the state of Idaho. And there's a lot to talk about, obviously, on a monthly basis with Kelton. So if you have some comments or questions, feel free to give us a shout in the next hour. That will be at 736-0300. It's 8:58 on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. 38 at our studios. By the way, the weather forecast over the next few days, getting warmer and warmer and warmer, up to near 80 by the middle of next week. There is some rain in the forecast. We need it. That'll be coming up Thursday and Friday of next week by the looks of things. No one's going to say no, but the temperatures will remain warm. We won't have that return to winter we had a couple of days ago. Fox News is next at 9 o'clock.